As America prides itself on being a tapestry of cultures, ethnicities, and colors, there remain pockets of the country that resemble a monochrome canvas, places where the percentage of white residents soars into the 90s and black families can feel as though they have stepped into another century. In these 10 states, the legacy of segregation never quite lifted. Economic and social barriers still loom large, and black residents and visitors alike often report the same unsettling refrain: "I don't feel welcome here." Whether it's in the form of casual stares at the grocery store, whispered doubts about your right to occupy public spaces, or structural obstacles to housing and employment, these environments challenge both newcomers and long-time residents to confront the lived reality of diversity's limits. Instead of bustling city streets, where voices of every background mingle, you find small towns where only one or two black faces appear on a Sunday afternoon. What keeps these states so overwhelmingly white? How have historical settlement patterns, economic opportunity, or the lack of it, and modern-day prejudices combined to create these demographic enclaves? And when a black family does decide to plant roots or a solo traveler dares to stop for the night, what unwritten rules must they navigate? Join us as we explore the top 10 whitest states, places where black people often feel more tolerated than embraced, and uncover the stories, statistics, and subtle social forces that keep these communities nearly monochrome. Iowa's endless seas of corn and soybeans conjure an image of quintessential Americana, but beneath that pastoral veneer lies a state where nearly 85% of residents identify as white and only around 4% as black. In Des Moines, the capital, you might glimpse more demographic variety across downtown's glass towers and the cultural festivals at the riverfront. But venture into rural counties, and you're more likely to hear the cicadas than spot a person of African descent. Black Iowans face a set of disparities that belie the state's reputation for friendliness. Their incarceration rate exceeds that of white residents by a factor of 7, a gap fueled by both historic redlining and contemporary policing practices. Employment opportunities for black job seekers can feel like a mirage, available in metro areas, yet vanishing in small towns where help-wanted signs rarely change. Some black families recount queuing at home buyer seminars only to discover that mortgage lenders quietly steer them away from desirable neighborhoods. Meanwhile, the microaggressions can be relentless. A cashier who forgets to scan an item until pressed. A neighbor in a pickup truck who slows to stare as you unload groceries, or the brisk congratulations you receive on being the first black student in a school enrichment program. For many, Iowa offers a stable cost of living and a low crime rate, but at the cost of constant reminders that the avenue to belonging is narrower than in more diverse states. In the rugged hills and hollows of West Virginia, coal-black nights and misty ridgelines may steal your breath away, but the prevailing social climate can leave your spirit chilled. With over 90% of its population identifying as white and less than 4% as black, West Virginia consistently ranks among the nation's least diverse states. That lack of diversity did not happen by accident. Jim Crow laws, followed by decades of economic decline in the coalfields, prompted many black families to seek opportunity elsewhere. Today, the state's economy struggles under persistent poverty rates well above the national average, with black unemployment higher still. When black visitors or new residents arrive, whether to teach at the local high school in Beckley or to open a small business in Morgantown, they often describe the same undercurrent of suspicion. Neighbors welcoming them with a handshake that lingers uncomfortably, shopkeepers who suddenly need to check prices from the back room, or landlords eager to show every other apartment but that one. Political power remains deeply rooted in conservative county commissions that have traditionally allocated resources through old boy networks, leaving many black West Virginians without adequate representation. Even within the capital, Charleston, where cultural organizations host occasional events showcasing African heritage, leaders struggle to maintain momentum in the face of shrinking grants and apathy. For black West Virginians, the journey toward acceptance often feels less like integration and more like a perpetual audition, a test of one's right to exist in spaces where their forebears were never meant to tread. New Hampshire proudly bills itself as the state that quietly looms large in national politics, holding the first presidential primary each election cycle. But when it comes to matters of race, its motto, live free or die, can sound less like an invitation and more like a caveat. With roughly 90% of its residents identifying as white and a meager 2% as black, the Granite State lacks the ethnic enclaves and cultural centers that anchor minority communities elsewhere. Outside Manchester and Nashua, the East land quickly melts back into village greens, pristine lakes, and the occasional no trespassing sign, an unstated boundary discouraging the unfamiliar. In small towns like Pittsburgh and North Conway, new black arrivals have reported being greeted with polite nods that never quite meet the eyes, as though their very presence raises profound questions. Why here? What does this mean for our community? On college campuses such as Dartmouth and UNH, black students find more active support networks, but even there, they often face informal quotas on campus clubs or hear jokes about affirmative action. State troopers' traffic stop data reveals suspicions disproportionately cast on black drivers, while local hiring committees, formed to address labor shortages, have been slow to diversify. Whether you dine at a lakeside seafood shack or stroll through historic Portsmouth, the persistent question may not be, will America be better, but will I be welcome? Whether you know it for its maple syrup, its abolitionist heritage, or as the home of Bernie Sanders, Vermont evokes a sense of progressive idealism. But the reality on the ground for black residents and visitors can be more complicated. With more than 93% of its population identifying as white and barely 1% as black, Vermont's small towns, Montpelier, Stowe, Brattleboro, often feel like living history museums of old New England traditions. That lack of diversity has created an environment where microaggressions flourish. The clerk who mentions, "We don't get many folks like you around here," the high school math teacher who publicly laments that she has no idea how to handle African-American hairstyles, or the neighbor who invites you over for chili but then jokes about keeping Vermont pure. In 2018, State Representative Kaya Morris resigned after receiving a string of racist threats, highlighting that the veneer of progressive politics can crack under the weight of lived prejudice. Employment prospects for black Vermonters mirror those of their counterparts elsewhere. Medical professionals, artists, and teachers make up a significant share, but face barriers in state agencies and historic innkeeping families that often rely on generational hiring. For tourists, the Green Mountains invite snowshoeing and sugar house tours, yet behind the postcard scenes lies a landscape where belonging must be earned daily and tolerance can feel conditional. Maine's rocky coastline and world-famous lobster evoke a sense of rugged independence, but its social map often shows vast areas of exclusion. With 94% of its population white and black residents making up hardly 2%, Maine's largest city, Portland, offers small pockets of cultural diversity: coffee shops, a jazz festival, a handful of soul food restaurants, but beyond the urban peninsula, the state quickly reverts to insular towns where the nearest Dunkin' Donuts is an easy certainty, and the sight of a black face still invites second glances. True, the old-time friendliness of lobstermen and forest rangers can shine through, yet many black Mainers cite encounters with landlords who demand extra references, store clerks who follow them around, or classmates who open their history, textbooks only to find that black lives and black history simply never left footprints in those dusty pages. The influx of Syrian refugees to Lewiston in recent years has illustrated a rare moment of solidarity, yet also sparked backlash from nativist groups. The state trooper's annual report confirms what anecdotal evidence suggests. Black drivers are disproportionately stopped, while job listings in hospitality and tourism often include implicit preferences for local candidates, a thinly veiled code for white. For black holidaymakers drawn by Acadia National Park's granite cliffs or the Kennebec River's kayaking routes, the beauty of Maine can stand in stark contrast to the realization that they remain, at best, curiosities in a land that often feels closed off. Mount Rushmore and the Badlands draw visitors from around the globe, yet the average Black American is far more likely to pass through than put down roots in South Dakota. Home to 90% white communities and a Black population of just under 2%, many of whom live in or near Native American reservations, South Dakota's demographic fabric tells a story of historical exclusion. Towns off Interstate 90 can feel like movie sets paused in the 1950s, where the diner waitress still asks patrons, "Where you from?" without expecting the answer. In Rapid City and Sioux Falls, you'll find modest efforts at racial inclusion, church outreach programs, a few multicultural festivals. But Minneapolis-adjacent suburbs still draw the lion's share of Black professionals, leaving South Dakota's core economy of agriculture, mining, and hospitality staffed by largely white workforces. Reports of racial profiling by Highway Patrol and Walmart security have surfaced repeatedly, while local school boards debate whether to include Black history at all, often citing budget constraints rather than overt racism. For Black families, moving to Pierre or Aberdeen, the promise of affordable housing and safe streets must be weighed against the reality of social seclusion and the challenge of forging genuine community connections. In North Dakota, the oil boom brought new money and some new faces, but not many Black ones. With an 87% white majority and fewer than 3% Black residents, this state feels like an oil derrick surrounded by endless prairie, indifferent to the diversity debates raging in coastal capitals. Fargo and Bismarck boast modest upticks in international students and refugee arrivals. But beyond those economic nodes, the land stretches wide and empty, socially as well as geographically. Black workers in the energy sector sometimes report being the only person of color on site, facing both curiosity and cold indifference from colleagues. In the hospitality industry, waitstaff in Williston speak openly of not having had to enforce diversity trainings because we just don't see anyone else. Law enforcement data shows that Black residents, despite being a small fraction of the populace, endure a disproportionate number of traffic stops and arrests for minor offenses, behavior quietly excused as just keeping the roads safe. If you crave solitude and the chance to paddle on the Missouri River without running into crowds, North Dakota delivers. But if you need a community that reflects your own experience, you may find yourself as isolated as the oil rigs on the horizon. The Gem State's mountains, lakes, and national forests draw millions of outdoor enthusiasts each year. Yet Idaho remains one of the least racially diverse states in America. With nearly 89% of the population white and only about 1% Black, the search for cultural variety amidst the scenic sawtooths can feel like an exercise in comparison. Idaho's history includes chapters of outright hatred. The Aryan Nations compound in Hayden Lake once served as a rallying point for white supremacists, and although legal battles dismantled much of that network, the after-effects still surface. Black residents in Boise and Coeur d'Alene speak of job interviews cut short by skeptical glances, grocery clerks who speed scan only the staples, and casual remarks about things not being built for folks like you. Community centers occasionally host Black History Month events, but attendance often hovers in the single digits unless they draw visitors from Washington State or Montana. For the Black traveler lodging in a remote mountain cabin or grabbing a late-night bite, in a college town, the sense that you are an anomaly is inescapable, an invisible boundary that whispers, "You are allowed here," but only as long as you remain a novelty. With the smallest population of any state and a staggering 91% white residents, Wyoming may be beauty personified, big sky country, glittering ranchlands, and the roar of waterfalls in Yellowstone. But for Black visitors and residents, the welcome mat is often missing. In Jackson Hole or Laramie, you might find pockets of tolerance among ski instructor collectives or campus intellectuals. But leave those corridors, and you'll confront the kind of small-town stare that blends polite curiosity with unspoken, "go home" sentiments. A state trooper's internal report revealed that, out of proportion to their numbers, Black drivers were nearly 5 times more likely to be pulled over than white ones. Local coffee shop owners admit behind closed doors that they simply aren't used to catering to minority customers. while Black Lives Matter demonstrations in Cheyenne and Casper have drawn thin crowds, sometimes met by counter-protests demanding equality for all, a slogan deployed to obscure the refusal to acknowledge systemic racism. Economic opportunities, too, skew white. Energy sector jobs are typically passed along through multi-generational networks, leaving Black applicants reliant on word of mouth that never arrives. For those seeking the thrill of untouched wilderness, Wyoming can feel like the last frontier, but it can also become the frontier of isolation. Finally, in Big Sky Country's sweeping plains and glacial lakes, you find perhaps the most acute portrait of exclusion. Montana's population is 88% white and Black residents hover around 1%, making for a social environment where stepping off the plane in Billings or Missoula may feel less like arriving and more like dropping into an enclosed exhibit. The state has drawn headlines for a rise in hate group activity per capita, and towns like Kalispell and Whitefish have struggled to distance themselves from episodes of racist graffiti and cross-burnings, remnants of an era when the Ku Klux Klan roamed freely. Black visitors to Glacier National Park recall fellow hikers' startled looks, and bartenders in out-of-the-way diners sometimes refuse service with thinly veiled excuses about policy. Even longtime Black residents describe community potlucks, where they are never quite invited, as though their very presence dilutes the purity of the gathering. Mining and timber camps once welcomed Black laborers during wartime booms, but those populations mostly moved on, leaving behind enclaves that today feel as remote as the buttes themselves. If breathtaking vistas and starlit nights are part of your dream, Montana delivers in spades. But for Black people searching for belonging, it may feel more like a vast expanse of exclusion.